If you happen to see my video calculating collapse, the worst chokes in college football, you'll remember the section about Lane Kiffin that I rushed through in order to help make an already extremely long video a little bit shorter. If you haven't seen it, go ahead and check it out. Otherwise, I want to revisit this deep dive with all of the left out details and generate a more cohesive ending that ties together everything that may have been missed while also bringing in everything that happened recently. As I was finishing that behemoth of a project, Lane Kiffin went on a bit of a PR tour, appearing on a variety of different podcasts like This Past Weekend with Theo Vaughn, as well as The Pivot with Ryan Clark and Company. There were a number of clips and quotables that circulated after these appearances that had me feeling a little jaded about just how brutally I criticized the Ole Miss head coach. That said, it still feels necessary to share everything I learned beforehand that led me to essentially creating a hit piece on the guy. Once we get up to speed there, we'll discuss at length some of Lane's more redeeming qualities that I hadn't covered after having a bit of tunnel vision to support my narrative. In the end, hopefully I'll leave you with everything you need to know in order to come to your own conclusions and have an objective opinion on one of the most controversial coaches in college football. Hating Lane Kiffin didn't become trendy out of nowhere. He'd been pissing people off far before ragebait became the mainstream. While many of his actions in recent years have kept the vitriol highbrow, a Reddit post from 11 years ago asked the forum why Kiffin is so widely disliked. Of the 144 comments, only a handful even attempt to defend the coach. The son of legendary NFL defensive coordinator Monty Kiffin, also widely considered father of the Tampa 2 zone defense, despite claims it originated with the Steelers' Steel Curtain, Lane used his last name to land gigs vastly beyond his qualification. Football nepotism is a widely spread problem, so it's not worth holding against him that much, but it is relevant as even for nepo babies, he's routinely outkicked his coverage. See, it's no coincidence that after having zero real coaching experience, Lane became the tight ends coach for the Trojans under Pete Carroll. Carroll took over the job from Paul Hackett, father of Nathaniel Hackett, and brought Lane in from Jacksonville where he was a quality control assistant, whatever that means. Doesn't sound like prestigious enough of a position that jumps you straight to the University of Southern California, but here we are. How did he get poached from practically nothing to a prestigious gig at one of the most historic football universities in the country? Well, it had a lot to do with his father Monty being buddies with Pete Carroll, someone Pete considers a mentor. The two worked together for over a decade at Arkansas, North Carolina State, and across various destinations in the NFL before attaining more prestigious positions. In 2016, Carroll even went as far as saying Monty taught him everything he knew about defense. So, hiring his son was a way of repaying Monty for the knowledge he had imparted on Carroll all those years ago. Pete wouldn't stop there though. He mentored Lane all the way to the offensive coordinator position. The OC position had been left vacant by Norm Chow, who was partially forced out. According to multiple reports, Chow butted heads with Kiffin on a number of occasions, including a screaming match at practice ahead of the 2004 BCS National Championship that saw the Trojans dismantle the Sooners while cementing multiple legacies upon their 22nd consecutive victory that crowned them back-to-back national champions. Allegedly, Carroll had been toying around with the idea of promoting Chow to assistant head coach while also removing his play-calling duties, such that Lane and fellow Trojan assistant Steve Sarkisian could assume that duty instead. Chow's departure is sometimes cited as a catalyst that stunted Southern Cal's dynasty at its peak. The following season, they extended their win streak to 34 before meeting with Vince Young's Texas team in the Rose Bowl. Our beloved win probability graphs wouldn't exist for another decade or so, but it's safe to say this game would have scored pretty high per my RCS metric. Lane's offense would generate a 12-point lead with 6.5 minutes remaining. Vince Young would scramble into the end zone with just over 4 left to cut the lead to 5. But on the ensuing drive, on a 4th and 2 from the Texas 45, just over 2 minutes on the clock, Lane elected to leave Heisman winner and collegiate legend Reggie Bush on the sideline. Kiffin's run call was then stuffed, and Vince Young would give us one of the most iconic moments in the sport's history. It's crazy how years of your life can be reduced to mere moments sometimes, but nobody took this loss harder than Kiffin.
I remember my wife after the game, I'm like, we had one kid, Landry, and I'm like, I don't want to wake up tomorrow. She's like, what are you talking about? Like, I do not want to wake up tomorrow. Like, nobody will ever maybe get in that spot again to win 3 straight. And we were right there one play.
In recounting the low points of his career, it stands out as something he considered the worst moment of his life at the time, being partially responsible for a loss that meant his team wouldn't be immortalized by a three-peat. On his pivot appearance, Kiffin offers some insight into the play call.
A play that had never been stopped all season long, including 3 times earlier in that game, 27 power quad. Like, you ain't stopping Lindell White on that.
It's easy to play Monday morning quarterback, but a little context goes a long way in justifying the decision. Getting back to Chow, when later asked if he would have had Reggie Bush on the field for that play, he laughed and replied, "I don't know," with a coy smile. It's possible this stuffed run call is partially responsible for Pete infamously calling a pass in a totally unrelated massive choke. The following season, the wheels would come off and they'd lose to two unranked teams in Oregon State and UCLA, the latter being a game where Kiffin's offense only put up 9 points. After just 2 seasons as OC, in a system that gave him the keys to the castle, Lane would become the youngest head coach in NFL history at the time when Al Davis hired him for the Raiders. Not that this marriage would last long, as he would be axed before getting halfway through his second season, and not solely because of his 5-15 record. In an iconic press conference announcing Lane's demotion to fan, Davis used a projector to call Lane a flat-out liar that brought disgrace to the organization, and suggested that he'd been conned by Kiffin. Lane tried filing a report with the league suggesting wrongful termination, but it was determined he had indeed been fired for cause. And even Davis made mention of his father, Monty, and mentor Carroll influencing Lane's decisions in less than admirable ways. Which is, of course, incredibly ironic, as in 2025, Pete Carroll came out of retirement to take over for the now Las Vegas-based team. The late Al Davis passed away in 2011, so whether or not he would have endorsed this union remains to be seen. Though if pulling out a projector to publicly shame a fired coach and his mentor says anything, it's possible Al was turning in his grave after the announcement. But as is often said, time heals everything. Davis also shared a story that I haven't seen discussed as much in the articles released following Kiffin being fired. That should serve as a disclaimer. The validity of this accusation is unknown. We're dealing with a lot of he said. So Al claimed that Monty was trying to get hired in Oakland while actively being the defensive coordinator in Tampa, in an effort to lead his son's defense. This would be considered tampering per the NFL's bylaws, so Davis consulted his attorney and had them communicate with the Buccaneers to avoid breaking the rules. He talked about Monty wanting jobs in Oakland during previous vacancies, and that while he admired him, he didn't think he was a good fit. Further reports suggested that Lane was actively trying to be fired by Davis. Again, whether or not this is true, Monty not being on Lane's staff will soon become relevant. One caveat about Lane leaving your program is that once he leaves, you may never return to glory. The Raiders have been back to the playoffs just 2 times since firing Kiffin, losing both of those games. And as if Kiffin hadn't fallen face first into enough golden opportunities, the Tennessee Volunteers offered him the position of head ball coach after firing Philip Fulmer. This would make Kiffin the youngest active head coach in Division I FBS. Before his departure, Fulmer had spent almost 3 decades in Knoxville, where in 15 seasons as head coach, the Vols won a national title, 2 SEC titles, and made the SEC championship game 6 times. College football is fickle, and sometimes a school's desperation to take that next step cost them everything they've worked for. Fulmer was gone just 1 season removed from an SEC championship game appearance. The Vols haven't been back since. Naturally, that means Kiffin didn't do much during his time in Knoxville, leading Tennessee to a 7-6 record. If you're worried it was his offense that struggled, no need, because he brought in his father as defensive coordinator. Kiffin's on-field coaching wasn't what made his time in Tennessee infamous, though. Instead, prior to the season, he accused Florida head coach Urban Meyer of NCAA recruiting violations, which he would have to apologize for the following day. Even worse, he told wide receiver recruit Alshon Jeffrey that if he chose to play for the University of South Carolina, he would end up pumping gas for the rest of his life, just like all the other players from that state who had gone to South Carolina. Safe to say Jeffrey did okay for himself with the Gamecocks. Kiffin definitely wouldn't make a pattern of lying to recruits, though. Across the country in Los Angeles, Pete Carroll was making arrangements to leave the Trojans for an opportunity to coach the Seattle Seahawks. Just a few months after Carroll left, the Trojans would be hit with a 2-year bowl ban, 30 scholarship forfeitures, and a number of vacated victories during their historic undefeated run. It's worth noting here that many amongst the college football world think these sanctions were too harsh. I personally don't feel informed enough to have an opinion either way regarding whether or not the sanctions were overbearing or an act of football justice. At the time, it's no secret that bagmen ran the landscape. As it's often said, everyone was paying players, it's just who got caught. The secret-based docuseries Foul Play is an awesome expose of just how perverse money was in college sports prior to the NIL era. Not that it's any better now, just more public, kind of. The man that would guide the Trojans through these speed bumps, Lane Kiffin. Just a day after Carroll was hired by Seattle, Kiffin was announced as his successor, meaning not even 14 months after he was introduced to replace the man that stayed loyal for 15 years, he was gone. Tennessee students rioted his departure. They set mattresses and shirts on fire. It was serious. What's crazier is that you have Kiffin, who was quoted as saying, "It was a dream job for as long as I can remember to be a major college football coach so you could be somewhere forever." He told Tennessee staff and reporters that the job in LA was the only one he'd consider leaving for. In fairness to Kiffin, he was doomed to fail in Southern California due to the NCAA sanctions, which I guess he wasn't made aware of before he was hired.
So I go there, then they have the sanctions from Reggie, which I didn't know about, and we lose 30 scholarships. So
Somehow still going 8-5 in 2010 with a 10-2 season in 2011 being even more incredible, as despite being ineligible for postseason play, the team achieved the coveted 10-win threshold. But Kiffin is just too prone to his ego. It's something he'd admit a few years down the line, quote, "I had a very large ego. Kids who are given too much, too early sometimes. You see it in actors all the time. Sometimes you're not ready for all that." After taking some responsibility, he continued, "It's human nature that there's some jealousy from guys going, he's this age and he's got this, he's got that, and a really attractive wife. People want you to fail. That's America." Just when you thought he was going to offer some redeeming self-reflection about how he enjoyed the privilege of his father's success while riding the coattails of another Hall of Fame coach right into being a head coach himself, he doubles down with an insufferable take. Lane Kiffin thought people hated him because he's a football coach with a hot wife. To him, that's all it takes. Spoiler alert, the aforementioned attractive wife would go on to divorce him. Prior to the 2012 season, Lane was selected as a voting member of the USA Today coaches poll. That ego got in the way when he voted his Trojans as number 1. He told reporters, "I would not vote USC number 1, I can tell you that much," before having to resign after the outlet revealed his vote in an effort to protect the poll's integrity. Kiffin, as usual when caught red-handed, offered a half-assed apology suggesting he made the comment from the perspective of an opposing coach. His team would actually start the season ranked number 1 before completing a 7-6 campaign that left them unranked by year's end. In sports, we love creating new words to more explicitly define a moment. Often these new terms reference a certain athlete's dominance, specific moments, or notorious blunders. When an insane catch was made at recess, you'd hear "Most" ring out. When shooting a crumpled piece of paper into a trash can, you might fade away and yell "Kobe." When your friend gains some weight after graduating college, you might say he's in his Kelvin Benjamin era. The point is, it's not uncommon for sports references to influence our vocabulary. But sometimes we lose track of their origins. If you've ever heard the term tarmacked, the origin of that reference is associated with Lane Kiffin. In the early morning hours of September 29, 2013, shortly after losing to Arizona State 62-41 in Tempe, Kiffin would be fired on the tarmac of LAX. It's one of the most iconic firings in college football history, and obviously gave us the term tarmacked. Kiffin's firing wasn't surprising. The week before, there had been fans chanting "Fire Kiffin" in the stands as the Trojans lost their home opener to Washington State. The surprising bit is how it was handled. The AD and university president allegedly decided during the third quarter of the game, resulting in an incredibly awkward flight home. Lane knew the AD, Pat Hayden, wanted to talk to him, so he decided to be proactive and approached Hayden on the plane. Pat was asleep, but his wife, upon seeing Lane, started crying. In truth, he didn't get fired directly on the tarmac. Technically, it was a small room attached to the private charter terminal near where the team bus would take everyone back to campus. It's still rare today, but over a decade ago, it was extremely rare for a coach to be fired in September at any level of the sport. Kiffin reflected on how devastating this was for his career and personally. He knew he wouldn't be able to get a head coaching job, and talks about the length of time between being fired and getting another opportunity as being especially hard. Since Kiffin's departure, despite a few very solid seasons, the Trojans have hardly returned to their former glory. Kiffin's replacement in the Coliseum would be none other than his old friend Steve Sarkisian. Sark lasted less than 2 full seasons. He was fired due to a number of reports that the coach would show up visibly intoxicated to practices, booster events, and possibly even some games. And apparently this had been a trend, as an LA Times article released shortly before his termination reported that this behavior was prevalent during his stint in Washington as well. Clay Helton would take over for Sarkisian. You might remember Clay from his appearance in The Worst Chokes, but his time in LA would be marred by the also mentioned Pac-12 cannibalization during his best years. The school would then poach Lincoln Riley from Oklahoma, who would bring along soon-to-be Heisman winner Caleb Williams, and as a parting gift, the Pac-12 would once again ensure that none of their teams were represented in the 4-team playoff when Cam Rising and Utah beat the team during their conference championship. As the two Los Angeles-based Pac universities prompted the dissolution of the conference, this comes off as a bit of poetic justice. Now, in the extremely competitive Big Ten, it remains to be seen whether the former back-to-back national champions will once again become a contender. I'm sure it's only a matter of time, but like I said, it's a fickle sport. Fan bases that lack patience can cause prolonged mediocrity. The two New Jersey-based NFL teams are a perfect example of this. Back to Lane. In comes Jimmy Sexton, a man Forbes considers one of the most powerful sports agents in the world. He represents pretty much every coach that is somebody in college football, including, as of February 2025, 7 of the 10 highest paid coaches, as well as 14 of the 16 SEC coaches. Jimmy represented Nick Saban along with Kiffin, and in late 2013, it was Sexton that united the two coaches. According to the book, The Price, What It Takes to Win in College Football's Era of Chaos, the notorious agent convinced Saban to take a chance on Kiffin following the tarmacking. It does beg the question, how many coaches from Nick Saban's School of Rehabilitation were enrolled solely due to the endorsement of Jimmy Sexton? A quick dive into his client list suggests that he's the agent for Mike Locksley, the disgraced New Mexico head coach, though he did work at Maryland before finding his way down south, and Steve Sarkisian, who took over for Kiffin in LA before getting hired by Bama, and also Clay Helton, who would take over for Sark. Kirby Smart, who was the DC here before his move to Athens, Mario Cristobal before he took the job in Oregon, Billy Napier before he became Sunbelt Billy, Mel Tucker before his head coaching gig, Brent Key before he returned to his alma mater, Charles Huff also made a stop here. Anyway, Kiffin would take over for Doug Nussmeier, father of current LSU QB and 2025 Heisman candidate Garrett Nussmeier. Lane's time in Tuscaloosa was memorable to say the least. He contributed to the Tide's first national championship in the playoff era. However, his relationship with Saban was demonstrably sour. A few stories from Josh Pate cement this assertion firsthand.
I am no more than 15 feet away from them. So Alabama, I think, is in the red zone. So they're right down at the very edge of the coach's box, and I'm standing right next to him. And Kiffin's there calling plays, and it was probably 3rd and 1, so I think he went like 5 wide or something like that, as he tended to do down near the goal line. And so Nick Saban, not fond of that. He was recruited powerful offensive linemen and running backs forever, and he doesn't do it so they can go 5 wide on 3rd and 1. And so Kiffin does it, because that's who Lane Kiffin is. And here comes Nick Saban. And I say, I'm going to get to hear this. Yeah, I did. Bama's on offense. There is no crowd noise. I could hear everything. I've never experienced anything like that in my life. I've seen Eminem music videos. I watched WWF in the Attitude Era. Never a single Monday night did Stone Cold Steve Austin talk to Vince McMahon in half the manner that Nick Saban talked to Lane Kiffin. It took the English language and it bent it in such a way that I've never heard it bent before or since. I've never witnessed a grown man talk to another grown man like that. It was as if Lane Kiffin was a 5-year-old child, and he just stood there and took it and took it and took it. And Saban is on the phone, calling Jimmy Sexton every name in the book, threatening to fire him for ever sending this expletive to my coaching staff.
But beyond that, there are a number of clips that demonstrate Saban yelling at Kiffin on the sideline during games. If this happened on the field, we can only imagine what happened behind closed doors. Kiffin still would leverage this role into another head coaching gig. While Alabama was actively engaged in the playoffs, competing for a second national championship in as many years, it was announced that Kiffin would accept the job at Florida Atlantic. As a result, Saban unceremoniously fired Kiffin prior to their appearance in the championship game. They would go on to lose to Clemson, but as Kiffin was never head coach, it's safe to say they avoided the curse. Saban would later be quoted by the aforementioned book saying, "I'm going to fire you, Jimmy, forever talking me into hiring that narcissistic
expletive."
But Lane wouldn't be the only disgruntled former Trojan that Jimmy would get to Tuscaloosa, as Sarkisian was also hired by Alabama as an analyst. Following Lane's departure, Sark would take over the OC role. I promise this is relevant to Kiffin's story, as he and Sark developed a pretty close relationship during their tenures together. Sarkisian had gone to rehab following his unemployment and had elected to embrace a life of sobriety after getting another opportunity in coaching. Kiffin did great at FAU. He would lead them to a CUSA title in his 1st season. In December 2017, he even agreed to a 10-year deal with the Owls. He and his father Monty, who obviously joined the staff as a defensive assistant, were slated to build something meaningful down in Boca Raton. However, just 2 years later, Kiffin would once again make a jump when it was announced he'd take over in Oxford, after the Hugh Freeze era was escorted out and Matt Luke suffered the brunt of the rebuild. The opening came around right as Kiffin was making waves at FAU. Unfortunately, like all the other teams in our recap, the Owls would fall apart upon his departure. In the 5 seasons since Kiffin led them to their second CUSA title, they've failed to achieve a single winning season. However, upon further review, it might be unfair to paint this regression in the same way that can be said for the Vols, Trojans, and Raiders. Those teams were all storied and successful before Kiffin was hired. The Owls, on the other hand, weren't exactly a contender before Kiffin arrived. In the 13 seasons prior, they had only finished 3 seasons with a winning record, maintaining an overall win percentage of .376 with just 59 wins in 157 games. Essentially the same win percentage as our friends in El Paso. All that to say, of Kiffin's entire career, even to date, the 2 CUSA conference titles in 2017 and 2019 might be his most impressive accomplishments. To me, this serves as validation that Lane wasn't just skirting by on the achievements of those around him, but actually learning, processing, and becoming a more well-rounded football mind. It's one thing to be deemed an offensive guru. It's another thing to take an objectively below-average program and not just win games, but trophies. This would be like an NCAA 25 Dynasty speedrun. Kiffin wouldn't immediately find success in Oxford, going 5-5 during his first season. Though, as with most things, it's hard to criticize anything that happened in 2020. Going 5-5 in your first year, the same year that our society was enamored by the Tiger King, gets a pass from me. But it's around this time that Lane would embark on his journey of self-improvement. Lane had remained close with Steve Sarkisian and used to think of his sobriety and commitment to becoming a better person as attractive, something he admired from a distance during their collective times together in Alabama. He eventually called him and started asking questions about the decision and lifestyle.
But when I was thinking about this lifestyle change, I called him. You know, I think that you can be attracted to people just by watching them. And when he was at Alabama, he was on his sobriety journey and he started losing weight, getting healthy. I remember eating a salad like at lunch and stuff. And I was like, dang, that's attractive, man. This guy's on it every morning, and that kind of sat in my head for a while, for years. And then when I got here, I called him one time and said, talk to me more about this. I think you might be onto something here. And that started it.
So it's here we learn about Lane becoming the man he is today, acknowledging that the man he was a decade ago in Tuscaloosa, and likely even after that in Boca Raton, is not the same man that he is today. He talks about how discipline is the greatest teacher, and how it's really just one day at a time. After that, Ole Miss would ascend to their current role as a regular contender in the SEC, going 10-3 in 2021, following a stellar season by then QB Matt Corral, who risked it all in their Sugar Bowl appearance only to be injured shortly thereafter. This was also the year that Lane would make his return to Knoxville. Tennessee fans proved they hadn't really gotten over their ex, and Kiffin would be showered with more than just booze. The Rebels would follow it up in 2022 with a solid 8-5 season, though it might be necessary to point out that they started the season 8-1 before rattling off 4 straight losses, the first of those losses being to Lane's old boss Saban. It's not abnormal for a coach to have never beaten Nick Saban, but I think with the added context of their relationship, Nick made sure his team was ready to play during their 4 meetings as SEC West division rivals, though most signs suggest that the 2 coaches have developed their own positive relationship. They now speak admirably of each other. Lane has repeatedly mentioned how much he values what he got to learn from Coach Saban, even if he acknowledges how much of a pain in the ass he might have been at the time.
Me and Nick Saban, that relationship struggled initially. And I take the blame for that. I'm an assistant coach.
But that relationship's almost in a way kind of like how you can struggle sometimes, maybe when you're in it with a parent, and then you get out, you get older and you get away, you get out of the house.
Yeah.
And then you're like, dang, man, he was onto something. He was right.
And that's where I go back to Nick Saban, and I really wasn't listening that well at the time, but he was on this about discipline, man. Here's the things you want to do, and do you do them or do you not do them?
And really, all else aside, having learned from all-time greats like Monty Kiffin, Pete Carroll, and Nick Saban, that's got to be the equivalent of an Ivy League college football education. Losing to Alabama and Georgia in 2023 would have the Rebels once again on the outside of the playoff picture, but cementing the culture change around the program. The end of 2023 would also mark the second time since Lane's hiring that his team would finish the season ranked in the top 12 of the final AP poll of the season. With the 2024 expansion of the playoff field to 12 teams, Ole Miss is one of those schools that aim to take advantage of the new format. I think, in part, this is why we saw the flood of money to Oxford giving them the resources to go out and acquire the highest ranked transfer class. The stage was set for the Rebels to finally get over the hump, make the playoffs, and chase the Dr. Pepper National Championship. However, just a few months before the 2024 season, Lane would suffer the loss of his father, Monty. I've spent a lot of time criticizing how the father-son duo chose to work together instead of imparting outside help, but I really think it speaks to the relationship the two had. Losing a parent is hard on anyone, and when that parent has been with you for nearly every step of your career, that relationship takes on a completely different dynamic. The football world mourned the passing of one of the greatest defensive minds the sport has ever seen. In response, many of Monty's former players and colleagues spoke of the late coach in extremely high regard, revering him as a man that gave his life to make people feel welcome, listened, and did what he could to improve his players as people beyond just what they could accomplish on the field. A reminder that sports go far beyond a passion many hold to escape their everyday lives. From an outsider's perspective, it's understandable how so many people can think it's stupid to get emotional about people you don't know running back and forth on a grass field. Hell, a few times a month every fall I ask myself why I care so much. But to me, the reality is that we don't care about sports because of wins and losses. We care because of the way it parallels life, and in part becomes a part of our own. Wins and losses are the destination, not the journey, and the journey is why we care about the destination at all. The same way the series finale of a TV show doesn't hit if you haven't seen the prior seasons. Experiencing the agony of defeat is what makes victory all the more savory. And for college sports fans, there is an added layer of emotional connection due to the way these schools are integrated into our life. They aren't just teams on a field or court, they are a representation of a place we choose to spend years of our lives. Institutions that prompt many of us to become the people we are today, give us lifelong friendships and profound memories that can't be replicated in other areas of life. They further represent entire cities or states, something that puts us on the map and allows us to feel seen in a way few professional teams can mimic. In remembering Monty Kiffin, we remember someone who chose to spend the latter years of his life giving back to these communities, and doing so alongside his son. If that doesn't register as emotional, I don't know what would. Ole Miss would go 10-3 during the 2024 season. They suffered a home loss against Kentucky, what I have ranked as the 7th worst choke of 2024 when they visited Death Valley, and then the final defeat after Jackson Dart threw 2 interceptions in the swamp during their loss to Florida. On top of that, you may remember seeing discussion regarding Ole Miss seemingly always being plagued with an injury bug. Maybe their strength and conditioning coach needs replaced, but really this was more likely Kiffin gamifying injuries and having his players take dives during calculated moments. Here we see running back Matt Jones collapse in agony after Jackson Dart points to the ground repeatedly. When asked about the validity of his players' ailments, Lane would simply allude to the rules allowing it and suggesting he wouldn't make any changes unless there was a change to the rules. Well, as of April 2025, the rules have changed. The NCAA announced that if a player goes down after the ball has been spotted, that team will be charged a timeout. In response, Kiffin suggests that he's happy for the changes, and that despite it sounding weird coming from him, his offensive scheme is one of the most at risk when it comes to dealing with fake injuries. So it must be that he was so victimized by these now infractions that's causing people to call it the Lane Kiffin rule. It feels necessary to point out that maybe Kiffin had a point in all of this, maybe he really was just using in-game moments to advocate for a rule change that makes the sport better and competition more fair. In fairness, when goats like Bill Belichick or Nick Saban abuse the rules in order to do things like burn additional time off the clock, they're revered as geniuses, real stewards of the game. When Kiffin does it, he's a babbling buffoon that doesn't care about the sport. At the end of the day, I can see both sides. It just comes down to how much do you really trust Lane Kiffin. Getting back to the end of the 2024 season, Kiffin didn't refrain from advocating for his team to make the playoffs, engaging in a social media campaign that had him stirring up major controversy around the sport. In recent memory, this was the most unlikable thing Lane had done in a while. And while it's understandable for a head coach to advocate for his team to receive recognition, the manner in which Lane approached it left a lot to be desired. Though, perhaps we should give the coach some grace. At the beginning of 2025, largely due to everything that happened before Lane got to Ole Miss in conjunction with his brash advocacy of his own team and potential of faking injuries, I was not a fan of the coach whatsoever.
Go to hell, Kiffin.
But as Ryan Clark states during Kiffin's episode on The Pivot, the beauty of our show is you have the perception of who someone is from the outside based on what they allow you to see. And then you sit down and realize they are so much more than that. And that couldn't be more accurate for me. I highly recommend listening to their full conversation. It's hard to listen to and feel as much vitriol for the coach. It really had me feeling guilty for my portrayal of the coach during the segment on the previous video. When you're making changes to be the best version of yourself, you learn to let go of control. To let go of your ego, to let go of things that don't matter, Kiffin said per ESPN's Chris Lowe. Everything I ever wanted was on the other side of letting go, which is the exact opposite of how you think, because you think you can't let go of anything. You're not trained that way, especially in football. This change in not only his lifestyle but his attitude is something that comes through when you listen to the coach speak, especially in more casual settings like the two podcasts.
How do you guys feel about third down package? Nobody wants to hear that.
I don't know. My first down package is pretty small. I'll tell you that. That's an old wiener joke.
Because like we had to win. That's all that matters. And
like John Daly used to sleep at a Hooters.
Yeah, that was a little different.
The loss of his father didn't spark a regression into his old habits, and his ability to deal with the trials and tribulations of life in a more positive way are truly venerable.
Because if you ask me that now, what do you want? You know what I want? I want to be a really good dad. I want to be a really good boss, a really good friend, a really good neighbor.
He talks about his journey to becoming who he is today, being prompted by things like being a good husband and father, realizing that he can't control everything, electing to take an approach to life more emblematic of Eastern philosophy, an attitude of not holding on to life so tightly, sometimes choosing to share the parable of the Chinese farmer, whose message is to take life day by day and not react so immediately to things we consider blessings or curses on the surface. So in the end, Lane's career has become far more inspiring than it initially started out. From being a Nepo baby with an ego problem to being so open to sharing his personal journey into finding true inner peace. While the coach may still make comments that rub people the wrong way, when you peel back the curtain, he becomes someone that is a lot easier to root for. A reminder that people can change for the better, even if it takes time. Further, the wife that divorced him has recently moved to Oxford such that their son, Knox, can be around his father. There has been speculation regarding Lane and his ex rekindling their relationship, but this time around, outside of a few reposts on X, Kiffin is deciding to keep his private life more to himself. While I don't think you'll find me rooting for the Rebels moving forward, I certainly admire Kiffin's accomplishments for what makes him a winner off the field, and as a representative that no matter how dark things get, it's still possible to find the best version of yourself.
I just let go and just let it go, and whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And the tide's going to come in, it's going to go out. I'll just float along with it.
The HOV lane, dude.